Hi friends, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about my 2022 reading stats. So I made these myself with the help of Goodreads in terms of like my star ratings and everything, but I always think it's really fun to keep track of and then go back and look at like my stats in various areas and the patterns and trends in my reading and everything. So basically with that in mind, I have done my I've broken down the books into 7 categories. Yes, 7. So those categories are genre, reading format, author gender, star rating, age range, series versus standalones, and release year. Now, because I've done all of this myself, for something like genre, I have not broken down fantasy, for example, into subgenres. I have simply just categorized all of that as fantasy, and for age range and stuff, like this is all decisions that I've made after reading the books based on just how I feel. So I may have some commentary on why certain categories look the way that they do, but for the most part, I think that the stats really speak for themselves, and I find it really cool to look at this stuff. So like I mentioned, the first category that I went with is genre, and so I'm going to put the graph up on screen, but, and this is not shocking, I read by far the most fantasy. 45 out of the 84 books that I read this year were fantasy for 53.6%. And then in terms of the descending order, the next most was contemporary or literary fiction at 8 books. Then we have horror at 7 books, which is kind of a surprise for me, but I guess I did branch out a little bit more into horror this year and I enjoyed myself, so I'm definitely willing to continue along that trend. And then next up we have romance at 6 out of 84, and part of me attributes this to the fact that like it being higher than some other categories is romance books are really quick reads for me. They're kind of like palate cleansers the way that I prefer them to be. So I'm able to kind of like quickly slot a romance in. Obviously 6 out of 84 books isn't too many, but the fact that it's more than something like sci-fi or like historical fiction and mythology or magical realism, all of those, well, first of all, sometimes it's hard to categorize something into just one genre. So if something is historical fantasy, I probably put it in fantasy rather than like historical fiction, that type of thing. But yeah, sci-fi and historical fiction and mystery thriller all come in at around 5% of my reading. And then nonfiction and memoir, the only one that I read was Jeanette McCurdy's. And so I would prefer to like fix that in 2023, because while that was a fantastic memoir, don't get me wrong, I definitely want to read more nonfiction than just one. So while I don't mind the fantasy category being so large because it's my favorite genre, I think that overall I would like to even out the others a little bit and maybe make fantasy like 45% of my reading, but we'll see how it goes because I gravitate towards fantasy and I'm not going to force myself not to read it. So we'll see what 2023 brings me. Now, in terms of reading format, I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by this graph, and I'll tell you why. So 71% of my reading is still physical, which is not surprising. I still do prefer physical books as my favorite kind of reading, but I was pleasantly surprised that it was only 71% and that the others took up 30% collectively. So 10% ebooks is more than I thought that it was going to be. I do not gravitate towards ebooks. I almost like have found myself avoiding them unless there's a book on there that I really want to read. So I kind of have to specifically like set out to read an ebook, whereas a physical book, I can just like choose one and pick one up. And audio being 19% was a very pleasant surprise, because one of my goals for reading going into the year of 2022 was to listen to more audiobooks, and not only did I listen to almost 20% of the books that I read this year on audio, I found some of my favorite books of the year on audio, and that was me definitely branching out from fantasy, going to the library, finding things that looked interesting, and I thought that was a great system for me, and it's something that I definitely want to continue. Next up, we have author gender, and so this one I am happy with in some ways, and I definitely see room for improvement in other ways. So the fact that I have read 38% male authors, I'm fine with that. 57% female authors, I am happy with that, because I do want to be reading like female fantasy authors and things like that, because a lot of the massive series that I've been reading have been from male authors. So I'm really, really happy to read from, like, say, Robin Hobb and like Madeline Miller and Ursula K. Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin and things like that. So I am happy with my 57% female authors, but I definitely want to make more of a point to pick up like trans or non-binary authors. I'm not sure how many I currently have on my TBR, but just based on like the representation in books out there, I am looking like to read more characters that have a wider range of identities, including being trans or non-binary, and I would like to read those from authors that identify in similar manner, and to read some like own voices stories essentially. And in terms of author teams, I have read 2, and one important point to mention is that I have done this by unique authors. So even though I've read 8 books from Robin Hobb this year, Robin Hobb is only counted once. So out of 84 books, I have read from 60 unique authors. So that means that 34 of those authors were female, 23 of those authors were male, 1 was trans or non-binary, and there were 2 author teams out of 60. So that does, like, that changes the numbers slightly. It's like, it helps to look at it in a different light, because, you know, if I read like 7 Terry Pratchett books, I don't want to count Terry Pratchett 7 times. I want to look at the actual individual authors I'm reading from and see like what the representation is there. So next up, we move on to star rating, and honestly, this is not surprising at all. My average rating on Goodreads this year was a 4.3. And like, that's not a bad thing. Like, I know that some people have much lower average ratings and are a little bit harsher in their ratings, but I genuinely feel this year as if I read really, really good things and a lot of things that I really loved. So the fact that I gave 32% 5-star, like, okay, let's be real, I am at like 75% like 4 stars or above. A few of those are like, no, I was gonna say that they're 3.5 stars that got rounded up, but they're not, because I'm counting those separately. However, I do feel in my own head that there is a range where something can be a weaker 4-star to a stronger 4-star, and sometimes when it's on the weaker side, I'm not willing to drop it down to a 3.5. But I still feel like I read really, really good books this year, and the fact that I had 2 2-stars is kind of surprising for me, and then 11 3-stars, 6 3.5 stars, but I don't know, like, I'm reading from some of my favorite authors in series, and when I have like a run of books like that where I love all of them, like, I think that that's really represented here. So I know that some people who do give lower ratings might look at this and think like, wow, but I'm happy about it. Now, next up we have age range, and this is possibly the most subjective one. The one category here that I know I didn't read any of is middle grade, but sometimes it's hard to tell whether something is YA or adult, and I've just kind of gone based on vibes, and I created a category where I said age doesn't apply, because even if though it might deal with adult topics, it may be something that I feel like younger people could read, and there's no like neat category to fit it into, even though I don't love the idea of fitting any book into like a neat pigeonhole, but I've just done my best. So 67 out of the 84 books that I read this year could be considered adult, and so that is basically 80%, 79 and change rounds up, and only 10 YA books. But there are 7 books where age doesn't apply, and this was like I said, this was vibes, honestly. Like, I know that I read mostly adult books and not as much YA, but it's still sometimes very difficult to categorize. Next up, we have series versus standalones, and this is possibly the graph that is the most satisfying to me, because I read 49% series this year and 51% standalones. And so basically what this tells me is that I did a great job making progress on series, but I also like read a lot of standalones, and so that makes me happy, because I don't only want to be reading things that are in like big long fantasy series, even though I love that type of book. I want to have a balance, and this looks to me like the perfect balance. Like, it is literally almost exactly balanced. So I'm really happy about this, and I don't know how it's gonna look in 2023. It's hard to say. I do have a lot of series plans, so it could skew more towards series, but the nature of like me as a reader is that I like to slot some like shorter individual books in between, so hopefully I will still manage to read some like literary fiction, some romance, like really whatever have you, even just fantasy standalones. So yeah, I'm really happy with this. I think that this is a great balance. And then finally we have release year, and so I find it fun to look at this graph and kind of identify like the causes for each of these numbers, and I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised, honestly, by the number of 2022 releases that I've read at 11. And I know that that doesn't sound like a super high number, like 11 out of 84 books for 13%, but I feel like I always have a lot of catching up to do in terms of the fact that there's a lot of popular older fantasy series that I want to read, and I was still managing to read a decent number of like modern releases. So I'm really happy with that. I think the most surprising number for me maybe is 2021, because I read 19 books that were released in 2021 for 23%. So almost a quarter of everything that I read this year was released last year, or I guess not last year anymore, but you get the idea. And like, part of me thinks that that is me taking on board things that I've heard people say about the 2021 releases, kind of setting my priorities on which ones that I think sound good to me, and then like bringing that information into 2022 and actually reading those books. And like, as far as I can tell, they went pretty well. So there were a few favorites for sure from books that were released in 2021, and that was a pretty pleasant experience. And then 2020 and 2019 were not as much, 6 and 5 respectively. So if you put those two together, you would get the value for 2022. But 2015 to 2018 and 2010 to 2014 are also kind of low, because when you think about the fact that there's 8 years spanned there, and I read 15 books from those 8 years, it's obviously a lot lower. But at the same time, I've noticed myself leaning towards newer releases, and then the reason that 2000 to 2009 has such a high representation at 17% is because of the like Robert Jordan, Robert Jordan, Robin Hobb, that shouldn't be a tongue twister, Joe Abercrombie, like people like that, like I mentioned, like catching up on the older fantasy series, and since I'm getting a little further into the realm of the Elderlings, and since I was finishing Wheel of Time, like we moved from the 90s into those 2000s era releases, and so there were a lot of those because I did read like a lot of Hobb, and we also had some Terry Pratchett that was released during that decade. So yeah, there's a lot of like older fantasy representation there, and it definitely is primarily fantasy that is making up like the 2000s to 2009. And then everything before 2000, I think that that's to be expected, like the fact that we've got 8% in the 90s and then 8% before 1990. Like, I'm not reading too many older things, and like I mentioned, some of those older series that I was reading, like I've gotten farther into them, so the publication dates are getting more recent, and so like that's a natural progression like out of the 90s and into the 2000s. So that's where, like, coming into this graph, I do find it really interesting to look at like what was actually making up each of these categories and kind of like identifying where my reading was coming from. But I do think that this was a really, really good like breakdown and balance. Like I'm happy with this. The fact that I was reading a healthy amount of like new releases mixed with some more classic ones, maybe not classic, but just a little bit older, since it's been 2 decades since the early 2000s now, which is kind of crazy, but yeah, so this is the last category that I looked at this year. If you have any suggestions for categories that I should incorporate into my 2023 reading stats, I would love to hear them. Nothing too complicated because, like I said, I do make this myself. I just do it in Excel, where I literally make a list and then identify myself which category each of these fits into, like within the given parameters. So I still would love to hear your ideas though, like if there's more things that I can take on board and look at in terms of the demographics and the stats. We love the stats. So I, as always, had fun looking at this because breaking it down is one of my favorite things, and I hope that you found this interesting. So with that said, please like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. I post new videos on most Mondays and Thursdays, and as always, I'll have my Discord and socials linked in the description if you're interested in any of that stuff, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!